So I want to talk to you today about what to expect when you're expecting trouble. The work I do most of the time these days is security support for NGOs and news organizations targeted by nation states. I started out in kind of enterprise IT security work and eventually started moving over more into kind of NGO land and working with people who had real problems. And I know that security is kind of an odd topic for this context, but really, when I talk about security, what I'm talking about is not kind of that technical stuff or that, kind of more violent stuff over off in the corner. It's how do we design systems, right? And when I say system, I mean anything that a human interacts with, anything that has some kind of structure, some kind of rules. It can be a purely technical thing or a purely technical thing until the user touches it, or it can be a purely social thing that's just about how do we structure social interactions. And I think it's very interesting to think about security for a lot of you guys, and I'll get to why in a second. Specifically, what I want to talk about here is how do we think about security? There are a lot of complex problems in the security space, just as there are in any of the other kinds of design that we're doing, and the tools that we use to think about those problems cross domains surprisingly easily. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on, is how do we think about security. So what is security? When I talk about security, I'm not talking about the technical problems or technical properties of a system or the technical problems of a system. Those are interesting, but they're not sufficient to understand whether something is actually secure or not. Oops. Not that one, that one. So security is the set of activities that reduce the likelihood of a set of adversaries successfully frustrating the goals of a set of users. Let's unpack this a little bit. So we have some set of activities that we're doing that compromise security, right? This set of activities are, they might be like looking at source code or redesigning a system. That's the set of activities that we're talking about with security. So we have a set of users who are somewhere over here who they're trying to get something done, right? They have a thing in the world that they want to do, and then there are some adversaries over here who are trying to stop them. So security is the set of things that make sure that the people that you care about can get the work that they're trying to do done. One of the things, and this is less of an issue for us, we are more used to kind of things going weird, things going messy, things going human. When I talk to technical audiences, I have to tell them time and time again that if you're looking at the actual human outcomes in a security problem, you don't get to just say, oh, it'll work like this because that's what the spec says. And, obviously things are going to go according to plan. This never happens. So you have to be, anytime you're dealing with an adversarial situation, a situation where someone is trying to stop someone from doing something and it's in this kind of space of human contested space, you have to be willing to deal with some messy. And sometimes you lose. When you're doing security for journalists in high-risk situations, that can be really tragic, but it's a cost of engaging in that space, and if you don't help people, they just lose more, but you have to be willing to deal with the fact that you're not going to win all the time. So why do I think that security is interesting for us? Security is interesting for us because any competitive situation is actually a security situation, right? This can be, so if you look at things like what we think of as competition, like if you're running a marathon, right? No one is trying to stop you. The other runners are not trying to trip you. So when I mean competitive, I mean a business situation, right? Say someone is trying to explicitly do better than you. They're trying to make sure that their product succeeds and that your product fails. You are in a situation which is effectively a security situation. It's a competitive situation. A lot of the interaction design that we deal with touches on things like this, or has kind of edges around things like this. If you're designing, I don't know, a sales meeting, right? You've got the big annual sales meeting for some multinational company, and they want to deliver a very specific experience. That is also a security situation because you're talking about all sorts of stuff that competitors care about, that is in this contested space. Possibly, depending on the company, you also have competition internally. Maybe you shouldn't, but So you have to deal with these kinds of scenarios. And hopefully, some of these tools that I'm going to talk about now will give you some ways of thinking about this stuff. So I've found that in addition to being kind of how I started thinking more about the experience design side of things, thinking about stuff from the perspective of users who are at more risk and users who are thinking about their security more explicitly is really instructive in terms of understanding the shape of this problem. The biggest problem that we're talking about when we talk about security is planning in the presence of an adversary, right? So that's sort of the formal name of how do I think about what the actions I'm going to take are when I know that someone is trying to stop me. So this thing is called an OODA loop. It came from a guy named Colonel John Boyd, who's in the US Air Force, and he was trying to tell fighter pilots how to think so that they didn't get shot down as quickly. And he has this loop, and this is basically, it's a planning loop. You can change the name of the stages. I think there's some which are 3 stages, there's some which are 5, there's a bunch of different names. It doesn't matter. Every planning structure looks basically like that, right? Observe where you are in the world, look at the facts that are available to you, orient yourself within them, and that means figure out what your potential courses of action are, what the things that you can do are, and what your adversary's courses of action are, how you're likely to get stopped, or how someone is likely to try to stop you. Decide on a course of action. If you're talking about a big Fortune 500 company or a nation state, this may take a little while. If you're talking about, 2 guys in a truck and a camera, you just go, right? Act, and then you immediately go back to observing. And one of the things which is really useful and really interesting here is you're trying to do this as fast as you can. There's this notion from dogfighting of turning inside your opponent. And the idea is that all else being equal, if you can turn faster, if you can execute faster in this loop than your adversary can, you're probably going to do better. This is relevant because we're dealing with a very complex problem. This is roughly the set of things that you're trying to keep in your head and evaluate in real time as you're dealing with security issues or really any kind of big, serious planning issue. I'm not going to go into this in detail. Obviously, this stuff goes a lot deeper. So a lot of what we're talking about here is cognitive overhead, right? You only have so much that you can fit in your head before the thinking about security gets rid of all of the space that you had for the thinking about everything else. This is very important because this tells us some things about the constraints that we're trying to design for when we're dealing with adversarial situations, right? If you look back here, this big thing up here, task domain practices, that's what you're actually trying to get done. All of this other stuff is a distraction. That's what you're trying to do, all of this, whatever. It's the stuff that you have to do to be able to do this thing. The more time you spend on it, the less time you have to do the work that you're actually trying to do. Which is why when we talk about security or when we talk about design for adversarial situations, what we're actually talking about is efficacy. Can you get the thing that you're trying to do done? Can you get it done efficiently? Can you get it done quickly? If you have a journalist who has perfect security and they've taken every possible precaution, they're not a journalist anymore. They're a security hobbyist. They're not actually doing journalism anymore. So it's always this question of balance and trade-off. And a lot of the time, worse is better, right? You do not need a perfect system. You need a system that is good enough that it improves the overall outcomes and improves that balance. So one of the tools that we use to talk about as we're trying to figure out, what are the things that we, how do we give people levers to understand, we're giving you this new system. It's a set of tools that you can use to change the work that you're doing, to change the outcomes that you're going to deal with. So we have this idea of an invariant. An invariant is something that a system, oops, a lot of that slide vanished. That's fascinating. An invariant, there should be another dozen things on there. An invariant is a thing that a system can try to preserve, can try to maintain, right? So confidentiality is an easy one to explain. If you have a secure communication system, the point of that system is to make sure that whoever your adversaries are can't learn what you're talking about inside this secure chat system or whatever. Now, in order to be able to use this in the planning process, the user has to understand what's going on. There can be a lot of different invariants. This is the start of a list that should cover the whole screen of different things that you might want to optimize for. Now, one of the complications is that you don't get these invariants magically for free. They don't just show up. You have to conduct ceremonies to be able to sort of perform the invariant, right? There are always going to be things that a human needs to do as part of interacting with some system, whether it's a purely social system or a partially technical system. And that's the thing that you design, right? That's an experience design process. You know, when you put on your hoods and you go out into the woods and you meet in the coven in secret so that nobody can know what you're doing and who's talking to who, you know, there's the ceremony, right? And the ceremony of putting on the hood and making sure that you wipe out your tracks as you're walking through the woods. You know, this is a ceremony for preserving the confidentiality of a certain kind of meeting. But the other thing is, if you're going to do this, these things need to be legible, right? You need to be able to understand what the invariants that you're using are as a user. If you get handed a bag of tools and you've never seen any of them before, and it's like, wow, this thing looks cool. Wow, when I press that button, it blows up. You know, this is not a useful thing to do to your users. You need to explain to them, right? And so for every one of that, you know, potentially really long list of invariants that you might add to a system, you've added a communications task, because now your user needs to understand what this tool that you've given them is, and they especially, in the adversarial context, need to be able to understand how it fails. And this is one of the really, really critical things that we run into a lot of the time. People build these amazing Swiss Army knives that do all sorts of things, and the users can just about get their heads around, sometimes if we're really lucky, how they're supposed to work. But in an adversarial situation, that is not enough. You need to understand, your users need to understand, everyone in the system needs to understand how this thing fails, what the failures mean as far as the things that you were trying to preserve for them, right? If you know, when this red light goes off, that means that confidentiality has been breached, burn everything. You need to label the red light, and then you need to walk your users through having a plan for what do you do when the red light goes on. So anytime you're dealing with that kind of competitive situation and you've tried to give someone a tool, you have to give them the plans for what do you do when the tool works, and the skills and the training to recognize it, and to recognize it when they're stressed. Because obviously this kind of adversarial situation doesn't happen, you know, it's not, oh yeah, everything's great, I'm gonna go for a walk in the garden. You know, this is, you know, you're sitting on a rooftop somewhere and you're trying to get the satellite phone to link up to your laptop before the sniper sees you, or hopefully something less brutal than that for most of you guys. But, you know, it's, you know, you're in the sales meeting and you're trying to figure out, okay, I need to send, you know, the new set of you know, projected documents, you know, projected sales figures, and whoops, I accidentally sent them unencrypted, and, you know, now the competitor or the trade regulator or whoever is gonna see them. The other thing that's really important here is communities. No adversarial situation happens alone. Even, you know, even if you're out there, you're an ultra marathoner, you're running, you're on your own, and maybe this is, well, let's pretend this is the kind of ultra marathon where people do try to trip you. You've still got a support team, right? You've still got a crew, you've got people handing you cups of water, you've got this whole structure around you, and you've got different people taking different kinds of roles. This is another kind of failure mode that we see, where people don't understand that they're working in a team environment, and that means that different people need different sets of invariants, and that those ceremonies, you know, there's a dozen people around that circle out in the woods, and they all need slightly different instructions and slightly different skills. So unfortunately, a lot of the thinking around this comes from kind of a military context, where they talk about all sorts of horrible phrases. But the idea of a success or a failure chain is you have a number of failure conditions, and you know, and it's like, well, in this case the documents leaked, in this case the presentation didn't happen, in this case, I don't know, the stage blew up, and then you've got a number of success conditions, and you've got a set of steps that you can think about in terms of what are the ways that a system can fail, what are the ways that a system can succeed or a task can succeed. Enumerating, and you're not going to get all of them, but having a rough idea of what are the chains that are going to lead to success and what are the chains that are going to lead to failure is one of the really useful design tools, because you're designing a process, right? And you're designing this kind of flow. And you need to, if you know beforehand that there are some of these steps that you really have to hit if you're going to hit the thing that the outcome that you want to hit, you probably want to tell your user, hey, this bit is really important. You want to think about this bit. You want to take some extra care here, and you need to understand that. So we can also talk about goals for system response. When something bad is about to happen, what do you want the system to do? If you know kind of all of the ways that something can fail, all of the things that can go wrong, what are all of those decision points that lead into danger, you can then come up with a set of goals. And you can say, well, when person, some adversary, probably someone that you're worried about, tries to make some bad thing happen, one of those decision points, the system should respond by doing something sensible. We often use a controlled vocabulary for this kind of stuff in the modeling that I'm doing. So you can prevent the attacker from trying to launch the attack in the first place. You can detect and log the attack, just like, well, we need to have a note that somebody tried to get into the building who wasn't supposed to. Detect an alert. Well, actually, that's kind of weird. Let's actually let someone know that this happened. Rate limit, like, well, we can't actually stop this, but we can slow people down a bit, right? And a lot of the time in some electronic attacks and a lot of physical attacks, that's actually the best you can do, but that's fine. All that you really need to do is slow people down enough so that it's not a problem. Or you can thwart the attack from being successful. And that's a lot of what we'd like to do, is to just make sure that no matter what happens, the adversary can't succeed. Having some understanding of how you want your design system to respond, whether this is, whether this is we're going to have people checking badges, and if somebody tries to get into the sales meeting without a badge, we need to take their photograph in a hurry, and we need to let, somebody in the corporate situation management team know, and we maybe need to make sure to kind of let everybody on, I don't know, let's say there's a bunch of live streams in the lobby, we're going to just turn off all the video and audio feeds there, because there might be sensitive stuff being said, and we want people milling around to see that, but not if we think that there might be some chance that people have gotten in. Having that kind of plan is a big part of making sure that you build a system that fails in the way that you want it to, that fails securely. So the way we get to systems like this, when you're dealing with complex cultural conditions, the best bet is participatory design. And this is kind of what we're talking about here. So hopefully a bunch of this is review. Recognizing users as authorities on their goals. When you're dealing with big complex systems that have a lot of tacit knowledge, a lot of embodied knowledge, a lot of cultural complexity, you as an outside designer, if you are an outside designer coming in, you are never going to understand all of the complexity and all of the nuance of that problem. So you need to work with the users directly and acknowledge that they're the ones who understand the thing that they're trying to do. Again, one would think that this is obvious. It's sadly, especially in the technical world, terribly not obvious. That deep cultural engagement, that really rich interaction with teams is what lets you kind of proxy their intent into the problem, right? So over the course of a long design process, you're going to make a lot of different decisions. Some of them you can make for the user. Some of them will be obvious. Some of them you're going to have to make for the user, even if they're not obvious. And the more complex of those decisions, you need to really understand, well, what would the user want here? And the better you know their culture, the better you know their context, the easier that decision is. For a lot of these kinds of problems and a lot of these kinds of situations, you need a lot of trust to deploy this situation, right? You've built something cool, you've built something new, now you need to get it out the door, and you need to get people actually using it. If you've engaged users in the design process, they can now be your champions for adoption. And they can say, well, yeah, I spent a bunch of time on this too. This is as much my solution as it is this weird outside designer who walked in. This is our thing. And they will then tell their friends and tell their peers, hey, this is our thing, let's use it. And that makes it a lot easier to get adoption. In adversarial situations, adoption is especially important because you're dealing with situations where people are scared, where people are stressed, where there's a lot at stake. It's not just hey, this is a cool widget that lets me do the thing that I was probably going to do anyway a little bit, more nicely. It's a place where people can be really worried. Short-circuiting long development processes. Again, this is something which is a big problem in the tech world. You spend a year and a half building this really cool thing, and you talk to some users, once at the beginning, and then you spent a year and a half and a bunch of money, and you shipped a thing. Oh, it's useless. No one's going to use it. It completely fails. Whoops, let's go start over again. If you've got users in the loop all the way through, maybe you don't do that. Blended countermeasures, again, this is probably less relevant for this audience. Anytime you have a bunch of really technical tools and a bunch of human processes, there may be countermeasures to kind of things that adversaries might try to do that you can build that are purely within the social domain or purely within the technical domain. If someone does X, we can stop them without having to worry about what the tool does technically, because we can stop them entirely in the social space or entirely in the technical space. But for a lot of complicated problems, you need the countermeasures, the things that are going to stop your adversaries need to cross those domains. And it's really hard to do that unless you get the technical people and the people who understand the users really talking in a deep way. And minimizing team ego, Yock talked about this briefly in the previous thing. This is that kind of third level participation, right? It's third level design, where it's not about your tool, it's not about the experience, it's about this is the thing that the users are trying to do in the world, and you're just going to help them. You're going to help them meet their goals. In the high-risk space, I say if you're building tools for high-risk users, you can either kill your ego or your user. This is sadly really true. Teams that think that they know what they're doing and are really like, yeah, we're gonna build this thing and we're gonna show these people how to work. It doesn't work. These tools are useless, kind of universally. So you have to be willing to step back and say, no, I don't know what is best for my user. Let's really let them lead. So I want to finish a little bit on, come on, there we go. How to think about thinking about systems. And what I mean by that is, so I started out first kind of purely in the technical space, and then I started thinking about, okay, we have these systems, we have these security requirements, how do we get there? And now I'm thinking much more in the design space. And there's a path there about how do you take a body of knowledge about design, how do you take a body of knowledge about process, about thinking in a context, and shift it to a different context. And I think that this is really useful because you are going to have out-of-context problems, right? You're going to be moving along and you thought you had a really good idea, and then all of a sudden this 40-ton alien lands in the road in front of you, and you're like, well, what do I do about that? What actually do you do about that? And I think the place where you start is really looking at the structure of the problems that you already know how to solve. And this is my bias because I am a structural thinker, but if you've got a good idea of kind of how the pieces fit together and you're comfortable with different kinds of abstractions, it gives you a much better edge on then listening sincerely to the people who have the problems. You go up to the monster and you say, so, okay, listen, Mr. Monster, how do you feel about cornflakes? Or whatever the thing that you're trying to design is, and you work and you kind of bridge those two things that way. Always be shipping. Always have something that's actually going out. Fast iteration times. I work occasionally with people in the academic world who do similar work that I do, and you have these people who've done these really amazing in-depth case studies, and they've spent 3 years on one example, and they've drawn their methodology from that. They tend to be terrible, because they haven't had enough examples to actually understand the properties of the problem that they're dealing with. I think for the 8 or 9 years that I was dealing with enterprise security, I would have a completely new system that I get dropped into with no context every 2 to 6 weeks for 8 years. And after the first 4 or 5 years, you start to learn a few things about picking up new systems and about whether or not methodologies work. So that kind of rapid iteration is really useful. Representational fluidity is another tool that you're going to find really useful. In the tools, I've hopefully given you kind of 4 or 5 different ways of looking at the same problem. being able to flip back and forth between different representations of the same problem, between different ways of thinking about the same system, whether you're dealing with adversarial systems or not. Being able to go from, here is the story of how we expect our users to come into this place, and here's what happens when they walk in the door, and then here's the story of when they meet the first person here, and so that's one narrative. And then you've got your diagram of the space, and you can kind of see, okay, here's the flows, here's the people, and that flip-flop between those two things is much more valuable than both of them taken separately. So being able to move back and forth is really important for building structures and building things like this. Lossy abstractions. All of the abstractions, all of the tools that I've given you here, they're ways of abstracting out from problems. They're all wrong, right? Every single one of these loses really essential detail about the problem. Hopefully they're not misleading, but they're all wrong. That's fine. Is it George P.E. Box? All models are wrong, some models are useful. Having a bunch of models which are wrong in different ways is more useful than having one model which is completely correct. The models that are wrong in small ways, it lets you make them smaller, right? It lets you get these compact things that are small enough to fit in your head all at once. And then as you flip between models, you swap out different mistakes. From here, I can see certain kinds of things, and I know that this model will teach me these things. And then I move over here, and this model will teach me these things. And then I can take the lessons from both of those, and I move up here, and I get a different thing. And again, that kind of bouncing back and forth is how you take an out-of-context problem and build something that hopefully you can actually, on the basis of your previous knowledge, work with. Pattern matching. All of these problems are, in the end, basically pattern matching problems. Intuition and really trusting and leaning on intuition is the single most useful thing that's come out of the experience I've had, especially in more technical fields, especially if you've got, there's a right way to do this. As soon as someone in your field says there's a right way to do something, they're wrong. But more than that, they're wrong in ways that are probably going to be really interesting and illustrative, because you're going to get those intuitions as you come up to the edges of the box. You come up to the edges of the problem, and you see, hey, wait, that's not quite how I thought it should work. And when you get there, that's where you are going to be able to build something new, right? It's always finding those edges of, finding the corner pieces in the puzzle, finding the cue and the go board. That's the kind of place where all of these tools, if you don't let yourself see that, if you don't give yourself the time and the space to see that, none of these tools will work. If you do, a lot of them will. And that's what I've got. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Man, do you talk fast, and and I'm the one to talk, right? And there's so much information there. I'm very grateful that we're taping this, because I'm going to watch this a couple of times. I'm pretty sure. But it was terribly interesting, I think. So I would like to take two practical examples. And one is absolutely terrible because it's connected to something that happened yesterday in Sweden, and one is so at the extreme end of the security scale. And the other example is that something that I don't think we would think of as an adversarial situation at all. So the first is there was what appears now to have been an act of right-wing terror at a school here in Sweden yesterday, and as you would expect, the newspapers this morning, many immediately say, we have to solve security in our schools. They cannot be open spaces. And then what people are envisioning is measures, like we have to think of the one thing that will stop all danger to our children. And I think that what I was thinking about when you were speaking is, security design. Of course, this is also a system. There probably isn't one. You can't put a guy at the gate, and that's never going to solve the problem. You need to think about it in a systematic way. But if you work, for instance, with public institutions, where openness, like libraries, for instance, where openness is so important, and the likelihood of something like that happening is on the not much larger than an alien attack. How do you even start to approach this?
I mean, so when we had those kind of different responses, you can try to thwart the attack, which is when people are like, our schools must become more secure. They're trying to figure out, how do we stop the guy from getting in here to do whatever he's trying to do? I would always say if you have the opportunity to prevent the attack, prevent the attack. And I think that, I mean, obviously, and this is somewhat of a political question, but I would say, you know, the best way to secure schools is to make sure that there's nobody who's disenfranchised in the community, to make sure that you have that kind of outreach and engagement, and that everyone understands that this is kind of a safe place for everyone. And I think that that works on a bunch of different levels. It's the kind of thing where first, you know, it reduces the population of people who are likely to want to do that, but it's also going to completely change the way people think about that space and the way they interact with that space. It's going to, you know, it's going to give people a feeling of safety. It's going to give people a feeling of community and watching out. And it's probably going to make someone who's coming in here who's maybe not part of the community or a disenfranchised part of the community a lot more obvious. And detection is kind of, you know, if you want to prevent, you know, or if you have to get to the point where you have to thwart, rather, the first thing you need to do is recognize what's going on. And, you know, that kind of speed of recognition is probably critical there. You know, we can talk about physical design and bottlenecks and these kinds of things. But one of the problems is that as soon as you start thinking that way, you kind of undermine that feeling of communal space. And to a certain degree, there's a trade-off there. You can pick one or the other, and it's really hard to pick both. So, you know, there aren't really any easy answers, but a lot of it's in that kind of trade-off and in those kind of social scripts.
Certainly, I think that's the kind of conversation that should be happening now, rather than the one that we're likely to have. So my other example is very lighthearted by comparison. So if you work, for instance, with interactive experiences, let's say you make interactive theater for an audience, you will always have a kind of participant who, and if you give them a lot of freedom of action, they can explore and they can do different things inside your experience. Some participants are always going to want to break it. They want to come in and they want to test the edges of what can I do? What am I allowed to do? What can I say? Oh, you say I can do anything, then I'm going to take my clothes off. Well, maybe not exactly that, but you see what I mean. So that's a other kind of adversary. It's not malice, exactly. They're not necessarily there to sabotage, but they can completely ruin your thing. So again, can you translate that into security thinking? Is that a security issue?
I mean, I think it certainly can be, given that you guys have different goals in a situation. And I think that that's actually a really useful point, that any time you have different actors with divergent goals, you have to take into account, how do you merge those goals? How do you deal with whose goals win? And my gut instinct for something like that is to say, okay, what we have here is we have somebody who wants to, maybe they want to cause some grief, but what they actually want to do is engage really, really heavily. Like they want to aggressively engage with this thing that you've built. So one of the ways that you can take that is say, okay, fine, you want to aggressively engage, let's channel you somewhere, right? You know, and you can think of it as a trap, as a honeypot, whatever, you know, that we're going to take the people who really want to play with the system and we're going to put them in the sandbox and we're going to let them play and they can do all sorts of things. But
well, we're doing our nuanced things over here.
We're doing our nuanced things over here, you know. And then hopefully you can figure out how to use that energy and use that engagement structure to then go make like really unexpected things happen when something does come out of the sandbox, but things that then fit in the structure of what you're trying to do. Anytime you can use someone's energy, you can redirect someone's energy to something productive instead of just like meeting them with a blank wall to keep them out, you are always going to have a better outcome. It's just a question of channeling and driving.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor Saitta.
Thank you.